I was told the vault had been cleared 3 years ago, that the tomb world was pacified, that what I was translating could not answer back. The glyph lit anyway, and the timestamp it returned was dated 200,000 years before humanity existed, with a harvest schedule that included next month. They assured me this was routine, that Necrons were dormant, that I was safe because the system said I was safe. I finished the translation exactly as ordered, and then they took my memory of what I understood, almost all of it. I was an administratum lex mechanic, seconded to Zeno's archival work because my record showed proficiency in dead language reconstruction and an absence of imaginative deviation in interpretation. My faith was evidenced through correct transcription. My value lay in my ability to render alien inscriptions into Imperial Gothic without inserting meaning that was not demonstrably present. I did not speculate. I did not editorialize. I translated what was written, filed my work under the appropriate authentication seals, and moved to the next task. The reliquary complex occupied the northern excavation zone of a reclaimed tomb world designated as Providentia Secundus. The world had been pacified through concentrated lance strikes and systematic purging of active Necron warrior formations. What remained were fragments, shattered pylons, dormant scarabs sealed in stasis crypts, and these 17 artifacts that had been deemed sufficiently inert to warrant cataloging rather than immediate atomization. The complex itself was a converted mining facility, its lower levels reinforced with consecrated ceramite and inscribed with purity wards maintained by a rotating detail of ecclesiarchy menials. I had arrived 6 hours before sunset, undergone the ritual purification protocols, and descended alone into the vault level where the artifacts waited in individual containment fields. The temperature was wrong. Not cold in the way that underground spaces are cold, where moisture gathers and breath mists. This was a dry chill that seemed to sharpen rather than dull, that made my vision clearer and my awareness more acute. My chronometer read standard Terran temperature for the depth and atmospheric pressure. My body insisted otherwise. I logged the discrepancy in my personal notation slate, but did not report it. Subjective discomfort was not relevant to provenance verification. The artifact before me was a small monolith, roughly 30 centimeters in height, its surface covered in hieroglyphic inscriptions that predated any known Imperial contact with Necron civilization. According to the recovery notes, it had been found in a sealed chamber deep within the tomb complex, positioned at the geometric center of a larger array that had been destroyed during the initial assault. No active defensive systems, no power signatures, just this single piece of carved necrodermis waiting to be classified and destroyed. I activated the translation glyph, a sanctioned linguistic tool developed by the Ordo Xenos for preliminary field analysis. It functioned through harmonic resonance, generating a low-frequency carrier wave that would interact with any residual energy patterns in the Xenos material and translate geometric inscriptions into phonetic approximations that I could then render into Gothic script. The process was considered safe because it did not activate the artifact itself, merely reading what was already present, like a scribe examining text written in invisible ink. The glyph answered. Light spread across the monolith's surface, tracing the hieroglyphs in sequence, and my data slate began populating with phonetic strings. I transcribed mechanically, stylus moving in practiced rhythm, converting alien sounds into Gothic characters without attempting interpretation. That would come later, in the secondary analysis phase. My role here was pure transcription, documentation without understanding. The first 3 hieroglyphs translated cleanly: standard Necron stellar coordinates, a classification marker indicating administrative function, and a timestamp using the ancient Necrontier calendrical system. I cross-referenced the timestamp against Imperial chronological tables and felt my stylus pause. The date was wrong, not incorrect in translation. The phonetic rendering was clear, the numerical values precise, wrong in implication. The timestamp indicated that this artifact had been inscribed approximately 200,000 Terran years ago. which aligned with established estimates for the Necron-tier civilization's final period before biotransference. But the hieroglyphs that followed the timestamp did not describe past events. They described scheduled processes, listed in administrative cadence with completion markers and efficiency ratings. I read the translated text 3 times, checking my work for transcription errors. There were none. The inscription detailed a harvesting schedule for a sector of space that included stellar bodies I recognized from current Imperial navigational charts. It listed population yield estimates, resource extraction quotas, and compliance timelines. And it marked most of these items as complete, with notation that indicated the work had been finished millennia ago. The dates of completion occurred 5,000 years into humanity's future. I set my stylus down carefully. My hand was steady. My breathing had not changed. I was aware of my pulse in a detached way, as if monitoring someone else's biological functions. The vault's hum had resolved into a rhythm that matched my heartbeat precisely, though I could not identify when this synchronization had occurred. I reviewed my work again, searching for the error that would explain the impossible chronology. Imperial dating systems sometimes conflicted with Xenos temporal frameworks due to warp-based time dilation and the inherent instability of galactic synchronization. But this was not a conflict of calendars. This was text that described humanity's extinction as a concluded administrative process, written in an era before humanity had achieved stellar flight, on a monolith that had been sealed in a tomb for longer than the Imperium had existed. The Vox link crackled. Remote oversight, speaking with calm authority, asking for a preliminary status update. I reported in measured terms. Translation protocols active and progressing within expected parameters. No anomalies in artifact responsiveness. Estimated time to completion was 40 minutes. The voice thanked me and confirmed continued observation. The link closed with a soft click. I did not report the chronological discrepancy, not because I intended to conceal it, but because I had not yet determined what category of error it represented. Premature reporting of unclear anomalies introduced confusion into the administrative record. Better to complete the full translation sequence, document all findings with appropriate precision, and present a coherent summary that would allow proper adjudication by senior analysts. I picked up my stylus and continued transcribing. The next sequence of hieroglyphs detailed resource allocation protocols. Specific mineral deposits required for stellar engineering. Biomass conversion rates for efficient storage. Temporal displacement methodologies for accelerating geological processes to optimal extraction stages. The language was precise, technical, administrative. It read like an administratum logistics manifest, dry and methodical and utterly lacking in the ritual glorification that characterized imperial documentation. This similarity was more disturbing than the chronological error. The tone was familiar. The organizational logic was comprehensible. I understood the hierarchical structure implied by the formatting, recognized the efficiency markers that distinguished completed processes from pending operations. A human administrator could have written this documentation using different symbols but identical conceptual frameworks. I transcribed 6 more hieroglyphs before the pattern clarified itself into undeniable form. The monolith was not a historical record, it was an active ledger, and humanity was itemized under pending operations, scheduled for processing in a time frame that had not yet arrived, but was referenced as inevitable, already noted in archives that existed before we did. The vault's temperature had not changed, but I felt colder. Not the biological response to environmental conditions, something else. A comprehension that bypassed physiological reaction and settled directly into certainty. The Necrons were not defeated remnants waiting to awaken. They were curators maintaining records across temporal scales that rendered species-level existence into transitory phenomena. They had not gone dormant. They had never stopped watching. They simply operated on timescales where our entire civilization appeared as a brief administrative note between longer periods of stellar maintenance. I looked at my chronometer. 17 minutes had elapsed since I activated the translation glyph. My hand was still steady. My breathing remained controlled. I completed the transcription of the current hieroglyph sequence and began on the next section, where the inscriptions detailed specific star systems marked for harvest operations timed to occur during optimal galactic alignment periods, all of which were listed as pending with projected completion dates that ranged from current imperial time to 50,000 years hence. One of those star systems was Providentia Secundus. The completion date was scheduled for next month. I finished transcribing the full inscription set and powered down the translation glyph. The pale light faded from the monolith's surface, leaving only the inscriptions themselves, which appeared as meaningless geometric patterns without the glyph's harmonic resonance to render them legible. I filed my transcription in the primary data slate and initiated the backup protocol that would transmit a copy to the Ordo Xenos Oversight Station in orbit. The Vox link activated before I could signal completion. The voice was different this time, older, with the formal cadence of someone who had spent decades in authority over classified knowledge. An inquisitorial savant, speaking with the calm precision that indicated they had already reviewed my transmitted data in real time during transcription. They acknowledged the chronological anomalies. They confirmed that such patterns were known to occur in Necron administrative inscriptions due to temporal displacement phenomena inherent to the species' relationship with chronology during their biotransference period. The explanation was delivered with confident authority, supported by references to classified research conducted across multiple tomb world encounters. The discrepancies were noted, understood, and categorized under existing analytical frameworks. The savant instructed me to proceed with the remaining 16 artifacts, following identical protocols. They assured me that my work was valuable and that the apparent impossibilities I had documented were precisely the type of data that would refine the Ordo Xenos' understanding of Necron record-keeping practices. They emphasized that these artifacts posed no active threat, that the inscriptions were historical artifacts rather than operational directives, and that the completion markers I had translated referred to ancient projections that had been superseded by the Necron's eventual dormancy. The explanation was thorough, authoritative, and entirely satisfactory from a doctrinal perspective. I acknowledged the orders and moved to the next containment plinth. The second artifact was a curved blade fragment, its edge still holding molecular sharpness despite millennia of inactivity. The inscriptions along its surface were smaller, more densely packed, requiring maximum magnification on the translation glyph to render them legible. I activated the glyph and began transcribing. This inscription was different in tone, less administrative, more instructional. It described maintenance protocols for biological populations, detailing the optimal conditions for species to develop sufficient technological complexity to produce resources worth harvesting while preventing their advancement to levels that would require military suppression rather than efficient culling. The text explained that self-terminating civilizations were preferable to those requiring direct intervention and provided guidance on environmental manipulation techniques that would encourage internal conflict without external fingerprints. The list of techniques was detailed and specific: localized resource scarcity, introduction of ideological division markers through selective preservation of conflicting belief systems, temporal manipulation of critical historical junctures to prevent unified planetary governance, strategic placement of Xenos threats to maintain species-level paranoia and military investment at the expense of stellar exploration capabilities. The methods were presented as best practices, tested across multiple cycles, refined through empirical observation. The tone was that of an experienced administrator sharing professional knowledge with future operators. I transcribed without pause. My stylus moved steadily across the data slate. The Volt's hum had become part of my awareness, no longer noticed as external sound but felt as vibrational presence in bone and teeth. The chronometer indicated I had been working for 31 minutes. 14 artifacts remained. The third artifact was a data core fragment, its surface covered in microscopic inscriptions that the translation glyph struggled to render. The resulting text was fragmentary, offering glimpses rather than complete sentences. What came through was worse than the previous two inscriptions. It was a performance review. The document assessed the effectiveness of various custodial protocols applied to specific galactic sectors over the past 60 million years. It noted success rates in maintaining optimal stellar development patterns. It identified areas where biological populations had exceeded expected complexity thresholds and required intervention. It praised efficient solutions and critiqued wasteful ones. One sector was marked for exemplary management. The techniques applied there had resulted in multiple self-terminating civilizations that produced significant resource yields without requiring direct engagement. The sector designator translated into coordinates I recognized immediately: the Sol system. The review noted that the current dominant species showed optimal development characteristics, sufficient technological advancement to produce valuable materials, adequate martial culture to generate metallurgical innovation, strong ideological frameworks that prevented unified planetary governance, ensuring internal resource consumption and preventing expansion into contested territory. The assessment concluded that this population was proceeding according to projection and would reach optimal harvest readiness within standard operational timelines. The date of optimal harvest was listed as 6,000 years from present imperial reckoning. I completed the transcription and filed it with appropriate authentication markers. My hands remained steady. My breathing had not altered. I was aware that I had been working in the vault for 43 minutes, that atmospheric conditions remained within acceptable parameters, and that my physiological functions continued without disruption despite the content I was documenting. The fourth artifact contradicted the third. It was a fragment of what appeared to be a communication crystal, its surface etched with inscriptions that translated into an exchange between two administrative entities debating optimal intervention timing for the Sol sector. One entity argued for immediate harvest operations, noting that the current dominant species had achieved sufficient complexity and that delay risked technological breakthrough that would complicate containment. The other entity counseled patience, arguing that premature harvesting wasted developmental potential and that the current species was following predictable patterns that would maximize yield if allowed to mature naturally. The debate was professional, thorough, and entirely detached from any consideration of the species being discussed as entities worthy of existence beyond their utility as resource generators. The tone was identical to administratum debates over mining operation scheduling or agricultural harvest timing. The exchange concluded with agreement to defer harvest operations pending review of updated projections from field observation assets. The date of that projected review update was 3,000 years in the past, imperial reckoning. I paused my transcription and performed a data cross-reference, comparing the chronological markers from all four artifacts. The timestamps did not align consistently with each other or with imperial historical records, but they maintained internal logical consistency within a framework that treated time as a flexible operational parameter rather than a fixed linear progression. The pattern suggested that the Necrons' relationship with chronology was fundamentally different from human temporal experience. They did not plan for the future in the sense that humans understood future planning. They operated across timescales simultaneously, treating past and future as accessible data rather than sequential experience. Their archives did not record what had happened. They documented what was happening across temporal ranges that rendered species-level existence into brief phenomena between longer periods of stellar custodianship. This interpretation was speculation rather than documented fact, and I did not include it in my official transcription. But I could not prevent the understanding from forming, could not suppress the pattern recognition that my training had specifically developed for identifying structural relationships in linguistic data. The Vox link crackled again. The savant's voice requested a progress update. I reported accurate statistics. 4 artifacts completed, 13 remaining, total elapsed time 57 minutes, well ahead of schedule for completion before dawn cycle closure. The savant expressed satisfaction and reminded me to maintain thorough documentation of all chronological anomalies for post-operation analysis. The link closed. I continued to the 5th artifact. The work proceeded with methodical efficiency. Each artifact yielded similar content rendered in different administrative formats. Status updates, resource assessments, population management protocols, harvest scheduling frameworks, intervention guidelines for addressing unexpected variables in biological development patterns. The 7th artifact contained what appeared to be troubleshooting documentation for addressing situations where monitored populations developed awareness of being monitored. The recommendations were precise and had clearly been refined through extensive practical application. Selective memory suppression of individuals who gained unauthorized knowledge, introduction of alternative explanatory frameworks that would redirect inquiry away from accurate conclusions, strategic deployment of contradictory evidence to prevent pattern consolidation. If necessary, complete population sterilization and sector reclassification as dormant until geological processes erased problematic evidence. The document noted that total sterilization was rarely necessary. Most populations self-suppressed accurate knowledge through institutional mechanisms that prioritize stability over truth, and these mechanisms could be relied upon to perform the required containment functions without direct intervention. I recognized imperial administrative procedures in that description. The way that anomalies were redacted to preserve doctrinal coherence, the manner in which contradictory evidence was categorized as error rather than revelation, the institutional preference for ordered falsehood over disruptive truth. The similarity was structural, not intentional. The Imperium had not copied Necron methodologies. We had simply developed identical solutions to identical administrative problems when operating at civilizational scale. Control large populations efficiently, and certain organizational patterns become inevitable regardless of species or ideology. I transcribed the entire text without editorialization and moved to the 8th artifact. The chronometer indicated 94 minutes had elapsed. I was moving faster than projected, compensating for the complexity of the translations through increased focus. My hands no longer felt cold. The vault's temperature had ceased to be a relevant factor in my awareness. I was aware only of the artifacts, the translation glyph's pale light, and the steady accumulation of text on my data slate. The 9th artifact contained population census data for the Gothic sector, covering a period of 12,000 years, broken into century-long intervals. The data was formatted as a table with columns for total population, technological classification, resource generation capacity, and projected harvest readiness date. The Gothic sector had experienced 7 major population collapses over the documented period. Each collapse was noted with brief explanatory text indicating the primary cause: warp storm activity, orc invasion, internal ideological fragmentation, tyrannid incursion. Each cause was listed with the same neutral administrative tone, classified by efficiency metrics based on how thoroughly the collapse reset the population to optimal starting conditions for renewed development. The most recent population surge, corresponding to the current era of imperial expansion, was noted as proceeding according to standard patterns with above-average technological development velocity. The projected harvest date was marked as pending final assessment, with a notation that this population showed unusual persistence characteristics that might require adjustment of standard protocols. That notation had been added recently in chronological terms. Within the last 500 years, someone was still maintaining these records. Something was still watching, still updating, still adjusting projections based on current observations. I completed the transcription and did not pause before activating the translation glyph on the 10th artifact. This one was different. The inscriptions were not administrative text, but complex geometric patterns that the glyphs struggled to render into linguistic form. What emerged was less a document and more a philosophical framework, though that term was inadequate for describing what I was transcribing. It described time as a medium that could be shaped through sufficient energy application, reality as a malleable state that would eventually return to optimal configuration regardless of temporary distortions, and consciousness as a contamination factor that introduced inefficiency into otherwise stable stellar development processes. The text explained that biological civilizations were temporary phenomena that emerged during specific stellar life cycle phases, and that proper custodianship required managing these phenomena to prevent them from causing permanent damage to galactic infrastructure before they inevitably expired. The framework was not hostile to biological life in any recognizable sense. It was simply indifferent, viewing consciousness as a side effect of chemical processes that would resolve itself naturally through entropic progression. The only question was whether that resolution could be managed to maximize resource recovery, or whether it would occur wastefully through uncontrolled conflict and premature stellar damage. The Necrons, according to this framework, had resolved their own consciousness problem through biotransference. They had converted themselves into stable custodial systems that could operate across the necessary timescales to properly manage galactic development without the interference of biological limitations like emotional attachment to specific outcomes or temporal scales comprehensible to mortal awareness. They were not an enemy in the sense that the Imperium understood enemies. They were the solution to a problem that the Imperium had not yet recognized as a problem because we existed within the time frame where that problem had not yet reached critical resolution requirements. I transcribed the complete pattern set and filed the data without additional commentary. My chronometer showed 132 minutes elapsed. 7 artifacts remained. The atmospheric window for orbital realignment closed in 48 minutes. I was going to complete ahead of schedule. The 11th artifact shattered the remaining structural integrity of my previous understanding. It was a simple memorial stone, its surface inscribed with a single name in the ancient Necron tier script, followed by a date of death and a brief notation about military service, the name translated cleanly. The date corresponded to roughly 63 million years ago. The notation indicated that this individual had served with distinction in the biotransference suppression campaigns, fighting against those Necron tier who had resisted conversion into mechanical immortality. The stone had been placed in this tomb complex deliberately. It was not a piece of recovered wreckage or salvaged technology. It was a memorial, carefully positioned, maintained across millions of years of dormancy, preserved with the same care that the Imperium devoted to shrine worlds and martyrs' bones. The Necrons remembered, not as humans remembered, with emotion and narrative and selective editing of painful truths. They remembered with perfect accuracy, maintaining records of every individual existence across timescales that rendered species into transitory phenomena, but preserving individual identity with absolute precision. This individual had died before humanity's ancestors had left the trees. Their memorial had been maintained across the entire span of human evolution through our development of language and tools and stellar flight and empire building. It would continue being maintained after we were gone, after our ruins had been processed for optimal resource recovery, after the last human voice had been silent for longer than we had existed. The Necrons did not hate us. They did not fear us. They did not even particularly notice us, except as scheduled work that would eventually require attention. But they remembered themselves with a permanence that rendered our entire civilization into a footnote between longer periods of custodial maintenance operations. I completed the transcription. My hands were shaking now, a minor tremor that I noted with detachment. Physiological response to extended concentration under suboptimal environmental conditions. I logged the symptom in my personal notation slate and continued to the 12th artifact. The final 5 artifacts yielded similar content to the previous 11, rendered in various formats and administrative contexts. Status reports. operational protocols, historical documentation, census data. One contained what appeared to be poetry, though the translation was uncertain enough that I flagged it for secondary linguistic analysis by specialists with more extensive training in cultural interpretation of Xenos artistic expression. The final artifact was another small monolith, similar in size and structure to the first one I had translated. Its inscriptions were brief, only 3 hieroglyphic sequences. They translated into a simple declaration of purpose, a statement of custodial responsibility that had been carved into the necrodermis with the same precision that characterized all Necron record-keeping. The translation was unambiguous. We endure so that the galaxy may continue. We maintain what must be maintained. We harvest what must be harvested. This is our function. This is our eternal duty. This is correct. The final word carried additional semantic weight that did not fully translate into Gothic. It meant correct in the sense of mathematically accurate, ethically proper, structurally inevitable. The only possible outcome of logical analysis applied to the problem of stellar life cycle management across galactic timescales. I powered down the translation glyph for the final time and compiled the complete documentation set. Total elapsed time was 189 minutes. All 17 artifacts had been successfully translated and cataloged. The data was comprehensive, authenticated with appropriate seals, and ready for transmission to the Ordo Xenos Oversight Station for review and final disposition orders. I activated the Vox link and reported completion. The savants' response was immediate. They acknowledged receipt of the compiled documentation and commended my efficiency. They indicated that initial review of the translations had been conducted in parallel with my transcription work, and that senior analytical staff had already begun processing the data for integration into existing threat assessment frameworks. Then the savant asked me a question that I had not anticipated. They asked if I understood what I had translated. I considered my response carefully. Understanding occurred at multiple levels. I had accurately converted Xenos hieroglyphics into phonetic approximations and then into Gothic script. I had maintained structural fidelity to the original inscriptions. I had documented all content without editorialization or interpretive addition. By any technical measure, I had understood my task and executed it correctly. But that was not what the savant was asking. I answered truthfully. I told them that I had translated administrative records indicating that the Necrons maintained long-term custodial operations over galactic stellar development, and that these operations included scheduled processing of biological populations at optimal yield intervals. I explained that the chronological markers suggested ongoing activity rather than historical dormancy, and that the content implied humanity was categorized as pending operations within existing management frameworks. The savant thanked me for my honesty. They confirmed that my interpretation aligned with classified analytical conclusions derived from similar translations conducted across multiple Tomb World encounters. They explained that this pattern had been identified decades ago by senior Ordo Xenos researchers, and that containment protocols had been developed to address the specific memetic hazards posed by accurate comprehension of Necron custodial frameworks. They told me that they would be issuing a memory sanction under the seal of necessary ignorance, a classified procedure authorized for situations where knowledge itself constituted an existential threat to individual psychological stability and operational effectiveness. The sanction would not erase my memories completely, but would blur them sufficiently to prevent the formation of coherent conclusions while preserving my technical skills for future work. They emphasized that this was an act of mercy, not punishment, that my service had been exemplary and would be noted in my permanent record with appropriate commendations, that the Imperium was grateful for my willingness to confront truths that could not be safely retained, that I would continue to serve with honor in assignments appropriate to my modified cognitive state. They asked if I had any questions before the procedure was initiated. I asked what would happen to the artifacts. The savant paused before answering. They explained that the artifacts would be sealed under permanent containment protocols in a classified archive facility where they would join thousands of similar items recovered from tomb worlds across the Imperium. They would not be destroyed because destruction risked triggering unknown response mechanisms in the wider Necron network. Instead, they would be preserved, documented, studied by analysts with appropriate psychological conditioning, and hidden from any context where their contents might spread beyond controlled environments. They told me that the archive facility was maintained by a dedicated staff of mind-wiped servitors and rotating analysts who served limited terms before undergoing memory sanctions themselves. That the facility had operated for centuries without incident. That the knowledge contained within its walls was considered too dangerous to destroy, but too valuable to ignore. They did not tell me how many analysts had been processed through that facility, how many minds had been deliberately damaged to preserve Imperial stability, how many people had stood where I stood now, understanding what I understood, and been erased from their own histories as a procedural necessity. The savant's tone remained calm, almost gentle. They informed me that the memory sanction would be administered in orbit after my extraction from the reliquary complex, that the procedure was painless and had minimal physiological side effects, that I would wake in a Medici facility with fragmented recollections of having completed a routine Xenos artifact, cataloging assignment, and a recommendation for transfer to less cognitively demanding work due to cumulative stress factors. They assured me that I would continue to serve the Imperium faithfully, that my faith would remain intact even if my memories did not, and that the sacrifice of my complete selfhood was a necessary offering to preserve humanity's capacity to function without the paralysis that came from comprehending our actual position within the galactic order. The Vox link remained open, waiting for my acknowledgement. I looked at the 17 artifacts, inert and silent in their containment fields. I thought about the memorial stone, maintained across 63 million years. I thought about the harvest schedules, updated within the last 5 centuries. I thought about the administrative frameworks that described humanity as a pending operation, scheduled for processing during optimal stellar alignment conditions, managed by custodial systems that had been operating since before our species existed and would continue operating after we were gone. I thought about the Imperium that I served, vast and eternal in human terms, utterly transitory in the time frame that mattered to the forces that actually shaped galactic development. I thought about faith and what it meant to believe in human significance when the evidence suggested we were a scheduled maintenance task in an archive that would outlast our entire evolutionary history. I acknowledged the orders and began the ascent from the vault level. The extraction was efficient. I was met at the reliquary entrance by a team of Ordo Xenos security personnel who escorted me to a waiting transport. The flight to orbit was brief. The Medici facility was clean, well lit, and staffed by individuals whose faces I would not remember even before the memory sanction took effect. The savant met me in the preparation chamber. They were older than I had imagined, their face marked by decades of service and the particular weariness that came from carrying classified knowledge across years of operational duty. They spoke kindly, explaining the procedure in detail even though I would not remember the explanation. They told me that the sanction worked by disrupting the neural pathways that consolidated recent memories into permanent storage, creating gaps that would feel like natural lapses rather than artificial erasure. They told me I would remember being in the reliquary. I would remember performing translation work. I would remember feeling cold and working efficiently and completing my assignment ahead of schedule. But I would not remember what the translations said. I would not remember the patterns I had identified. I would not remember understanding. They asked if I wanted to record any final thoughts before the procedure, a personal log that would be sealed and stored with my file for possible future review if clearance levels changed or if therapeutic integration became feasible. I declined. What would I say that had not already been documented in the official transcription records? What personal observation could I add that would change the fundamental reality of what I had learned? The Necrons endured so that the galaxy might continue. They maintained what must be maintained. They harvested what must be harvested. This was their function. This was their eternal duty. This was correct. And the Imperium endured so that humanity might continue. We maintained what must be maintained. We suppressed what must be suppressed. This was our function. This was our duty. This was also correct, within the limited time frame where correctness mattered to beings who measured existence in centuries rather than geological epochs. The savant administered the memory sanction personally. The procedure involved a series of injections followed by induced theta wave sleep states, while trained psychers performed selective neural pathway disruption. I was told it would take approximately 6 hours and that I would wake with minimal physical discomfort. I do not remember the procedure itself. I remember waking in a recovery chamber with soft lighting and a chronometer that indicated 3 days had passed. I remember a Medicae orderly explaining that I had experienced minor complications requiring extended observation, but that all cognitive functions had been tested and certified as within acceptable parameters. I remember being told that I had been recommended for transfer to a less demanding assignment due to cumulative stress factors related to extended exposure to classified materials. I remember being confused about what assignment I had been performing and being told not to worry, that such lapses were common after periods of intense concentration under suboptimal conditions. I remember signing documentation that I could not read and did not understand, processed through with efficient kindness by administrative staff who had clearly managed many similar cases. I remember being assigned to a transport heading to the Segmentum Obscurus, where I would take up a posting as a senior lexicographic analyst for a subsector administratum facility processing standard trade manifests and colonial population census data. I remember thinking that this seemed like a significant reduction in responsibility for reasons I could not identify, and being told that my service record showed exemplary performance that would be rewarded with a posting allowing greater work-life balance and reduced cognitive demands. I remember not understanding what I had done to warrant such consideration and being told not to concern myself with matters above my current clearance level. I remember boarding the transport and watching Providentia Secundus recede into the darkness, a pacified tomb world scheduled for colonial resettlement once the final Xenos artifact processing had been completed and the planet had been certified as safe for human habitation. I remember wondering if I had contributed to that certification and being unable to recall the details of my work clearly enough to know. The transport voyage lasted 6 weeks. I spent the time reviewing lexicographic reference materials and reacquainting myself with standard translation protocols for common Gothic dialects and trade languages. The work was straightforward, almost comforting in its simplicity. I found myself grateful for the transfer, even though I could not remember what I was being transferred from. The subsector administratum facility was located on a minor hive world designated as Tarsus Secundus, an unremarkable planet notable only for its strategic position along several major trade routes and its long history of stable governance. My posting was on the facility's 17th floor, a vast open chamber filled with rows of lexicographic workstations where analysts like myself processed commercial documentation for accuracy and compliance with sector-wide trade standards. The work was precisely what had been described: reviewing cargo manifests, verifying population census data, translating commercial contracts between Gothic and local planetary dialects, ensuring that all documentation met the formatting requirements specified in the administratum's extensive regulatory frameworks. It was important work, necessary for maintaining the complex web of commerce and governance that sustained the Imperium. It was also mind-numbingly repetitive, requiring attention to detail without significant analytical engagement or interpretive complexity. I performed my duties efficiently. My work was consistently rated as exemplary by supervisory review. I was commended for my accuracy and speed, and within a year I had been promoted to senior analyst with responsibility for training newer lexicographic staff in proper documentation protocols. My life developed a comfortable routine. I woke each morning in my assigned quarters, performed the mandatory dawn prayers, consumed standard rations, and reported to my workstation by the designated hour. I processed documentation for 8 hours with appropriate breaks for meals and devotional observances. I filed my completed work with proper authentication markers and returned to my quarters for evening prayers and personal time. I attended weekly services at the facility's chapel, participated in mandatory loyalty affirmations, and maintained the minimal social connections appropriate for someone of my rank and function. I did not form close relationships. I did not engage in controversial discussions. I performed my duties, honored the Emperor, and contributed to the Imperium's eternal function with quiet competence. I was content, not happy in any profound sense, but satisfied with the rightness of my place within the vast machinery of Imperial civilization. I served a purpose. My work mattered. The system functioned because people like me performed their assigned tasks with diligence and faith. Sometimes I experienced moments of disorientation that I could not explain. Brief gaps in my awareness where I would find myself staring at my data slate without remembering what I had been about to transcribe. Moments where the facility's ventilation hum would seem to synchronize with my pulse in a way that felt significant without being able to identify why. Dreams involving cold places and pale light that faded upon waking, leaving only vague unease that dispersed with morning prayers. I attributed these experiences to normal cognitive wear from extended service and did not report them to Medicaid staff. They were not severe enough to impair my work performance. They did not prevent me from fulfilling my duties. They were simply minor anomalies in an otherwise stable pattern of faithful service. 3 years into my posting, I was assigned to process a census update from a newly compliant frontier colony. The documentation was straightforward population counts broken down by age cohort, occupational category, and genetic purity classification. Standard data formatted in standard ways, requiring only verification that local officials had completed the forms correctly. I began transcribing the data into the central registry, moving through the forms with practiced efficiency. Population totals, age distributions, resource generation capacity, projected growth rates over the next century. I paused at that final category without understanding why. Projected growth rates were standard census components. All colonial populations were required to provide estimates for resource planning purposes. There was nothing unusual about the data I was reviewing. The projections were modest, accounting for expected mortality from harsh frontier conditions and limited medical infrastructure. The colony administrators had been realistic rather than optimistic, which suggested competent governance. But something about the format bothered me. The way the data was organized into century-long intervals. The neutral administrative tone describing population development as a scheduled process with measurable efficiency metrics. The projection extending multiple centuries into the future with casual certainty, as if the colony's persistence was an inevitable fact requiring only proper maintenance to achieve expected outcomes. I completed the transcription and filed the documentation without additional comment. But the unease persisted. A vague sense that I had encountered this pattern before in a context I could not remember. That night I dreamed of pale light tracing geometric patterns across surfaces I could not identify. I woke with the certainty that I had understood something important that was now just beyond my reach. A truth that existed in the space between what I could remember and what I had forgotten. I performed my dawn prayers with particular intensity, seeking comfort in the familiar litanies and the Emperor's eternal protection. The unease faded with morning routine, buried under the accumulated weight of process documentation and proper procedure. This happened more frequently over the following years. Brief moments of dissonance triggered by specific administrative formats or particular phrasings in the documentation I processed. gaps in my awareness that lasted seconds or minutes, leaving me staring at my workstation without clear recollection of the preceding moments. Dreams involving cold precision and terrible patience, fragments that dispersed upon waking but left residue in my waking thoughts. I began to notice patterns in the work I processed. Not errors exactly, but coincidences that accumulated into uncomfortable implications. Frontier colonies that reported population losses blamed on unexplained phenomena that were never investigated beyond initial reports. Sectors where multiple civilizations had collapsed over millennia for reasons that were documented but never adequately explained. Trade routes that persisted despite sustained losses, maintained through bureaucratic inertia rather than strategic value. The Imperium was vast. Inefficiencies were inevitable at civilizational scale. Resources were limited, and threats were many. Not every anomaly could be investigated. Not every pattern indicated conspiracy. The administratum functioned through categorical simplification, reducing complexity to manageable documentation, and that process necessarily involved loss of nuance and detail. I knew this. I accepted this. My faith did not require perfect understanding. It required obedience to rightful authority and trust that those who governed possessed knowledge and perspective that individual servants could not access. But sometimes, processing documentation deep into a night shift when the facility was quiet and my mind was tired, I would catch glimpses of a larger pattern that terrified me for reasons I could not articulate. A sense that humanity's great project was not as eternal as our doctrine insisted, that our persistence was not guaranteed by the Emperor's will but contingent on factors we did not control and could not perceive, that we endured not through strength but through being scheduled to endure for some span that had been determined by forces operating on timescales where our entire civilization was a transitory phenomenon. These thoughts were heretical. I recognized them as such. I performed immediate penance, reciting the appropriate litanies and reporting to the facility's confessor for ritual purification. I was counseled that such doubts were common among those who processed vast quantities of data without sufficient spiritual grounding, and was prescribed increased devotional practice and reduced work hours. The prescription helped. The doubts faded back into vague unease that I learned to ignore. My work continued. Years accumulated into decades. I served faithfully, processed my assigned documentation, trained junior analysts in proper procedure, and honored the Emperor through diligent fulfillment of my appointed function. I was 53 years old when I received notification that I was being granted retirement with full honors after 37 years of exemplary service. The announcement included commendations for accuracy, efficiency, and faithful dedication to duty. I was offered a modest pension and housing in the facility's retirement quarters, a small but comfortable space where I could live out my remaining years in peace. I accepted with gratitude that felt automatic rather than genuine. Retirement was strange. Without the structure of daily work, time became shapeless and difficult to organize. I attended chapel services more frequently, participated in facility social activities for retired personnel, and spent long hours in my quarters reading approved devotional texts. I began to forget things with greater frequency. Names I had known for years, procedures I had performed thousands of times, the sequence of basic prayers that I had recited since childhood. Medical staff assured me this was normal cognitive decline associated with advanced age and extended service under conditions that had accumulated minor neurological stress over decades. They prescribed supplements and therapeutic regimens that provided minimal improvement. I accepted their explanations without question. What else could I do? Sometimes in the evening, sitting in my quarters watching the Hive City lights through my narrow window, I would experience moments of profound dissociation. A sense that I was not fully present in my own awareness, that some essential part of my identity had been removed or damaged or hidden from me, and that I had lived for decades as a partial person performing functions without understanding why those functions mattered. These moments passed. The feeling faded. I return to my devotional texts and my prayers and my quiet routines. I am 61 years old now. My memory continues to deteriorate. I struggle to remember faces and names. I sometimes forget where I am or why I came to a particular room. Medical staff have informed me that this progression is expected and that I should prepare for eventual transfer to full-time medical care as my condition worsens. I accept this with the same faith that has sustained me throughout my service. The Emperor protects. The Imperium endures. My life has meaning because I have served faithfully, and that service will be remembered by the system, even if I cannot remember it myself. But sometimes, in moments of clarity between the fog of failing cognition, I remember pale light and geometric patterns. I remember cold that sharpened awareness rather than dulled it. I remember understanding something terrible and being unable to hold on to that understanding, as if my mind had been deliberately edited to remove specific knowledge while preserving the emotional resonance of having known. I remember that I translated something once, long ago, on a world whose name I cannot recall, that what I translated was important and dangerous, that I was honored for my work and then damaged for my knowledge, that I have lived the remainder of my life as a deliberate diminishment shaped into a form that could serve without remembering why service was necessary. I remember that the system functions correctly, that what was done to me was done for valid reasons, that my sacrifice was necessary, and that I should be grateful for the mercy that allowed me to continue serving in any capacity rather than being terminated completely. I remember that I believe this. I remember that I must believe this. I remember that I have no choice but to believe this. The night cycle is beginning now. The facility's lights are dimming to evening setting. I should perform my evening prayers and retire to sleep. Tomorrow I have a scheduled appointment with medical staff for routine cognitive assessment. They will ask me questions to determine current functionality levels. They will document my decline in appropriate categories. They will update my medical file with proper notation. The system will function correctly because that is what systems do. I will serve until I cannot serve, and then I will be processed with appropriate efficiency, and my contribution will be noted in records that will persist long after I am forgotten. This is correct. This is my function. This is all any of us can expect. In an Imperium that endures across spans of time that render individual existence into transitory phenomena between longer periods of proper maintenance. I believe this. I must believe this. I have no memory of ever believing anything else. The pale light fades. The geometric patterns dissolve. The cold precision recedes into comfortable numbness. I perform my prayers from memory that is failing but still sufficient for familiar litanies. I honor the Emperor. I trust in his protection. I accept my place within the vast machinery of human civilization. I sleep without dreams that I remember upon waking. Somewhere, in sealed vaults maintained by mind-wiped servitors and rotating analysts who serve limited terms before undergoing memory sanctions themselves, 17 artifacts rest in containment fields, inert and silent and patiently waiting. Somewhere, custodial systems maintain their eternal function, updating archives and refining schedules and preparing for harvest operations that will occur during optimal stellar alignment conditions, in timeframes measured in centuries and millennia rather than human lifespans. Somewhere, the truth persists in its terrible completeness, preserved because it is too dangerous to destroy but too valuable to ignore, studied by those who will be systematically damaged for their knowledge, because the alternative is paralysis that would prevent the Imperium from functioning at all. And somewhere, in the fragmented memories of an aging lexicographic analyst who can no longer remember his own name with consistent accuracy, a truth remains buried but not entirely erased. A knowledge that surfaces in dreams and moments of disorientation. A comprehension that was learned and then forcibly unlearned but left traces that cannot be completely removed. The Necrons are not terrifying because they hate us or fear us or even particularly notice us. They are terrifying because they are patient, because they maintain perfect archives across timescales that render our entire existence into scheduled work, because they have been watching since before we existed and will continue watching after we are gone, because they operate with the calm efficiency of administrators performing necessary tasks, and we are one of those tasks, pending completion during optimal processing windows. They are terrifying because they are correct, in a time frame where correctness means something fundamentally different than human wisdom can comprehend. They are terrifying because we cannot fight patience measured in millions of years, cannot resist archival systems that document our extinction as a concluded fact written before we achieved consciousness, cannot escape harvest schedules that list our species as pending operations alongside stellar maintenance tasks and resource extraction protocols. They are terrifying because the Imperium knows this, has known this for centuries, and has developed institutional mechanisms to suppress that knowledge while continuing to function as if our persistence was eternal and our significance was divinely ordained. They are terrifying because faith requires belief in human exceptionalism and cosmic purpose, and accurate comprehension of the Necrons' custodial frameworks makes such belief impossible to maintain. They are terrifying because the truth about them must be learned and then forcibly forgotten, over and over, by every individual who encounters it, because the only alternative is civilizational paralysis that would be even more fatal than ignorant persistence. They are terrifying because they are not monsters or demons or enemies in any meaningful sense. They are the solution to a problem we do not have the perspective to recognize as a problem. They are the correct answer to questions we cannot afford to ask. They are terrifying because I understood this once, completely, and was mercy killed for my understanding while being allowed to continue existing as a damaged fragment, performing functions without remembering why. They are terrifying because I still understand, in the spaces between what I can remember and what was taken from me, and there is nothing I can do with that understanding except endure until my biological processes cease and my contribution is processed into appropriate documentation, and I am forgotten by systems that will persist long after humanity has been harvested and processed and converted into optimal resource configurations. This is terror, not fear, but comprehension without escape, knowledge without utility. Understanding that changes nothing because the timeframes involved render human action into meaningless gestures against inevitable outcomes. I finish my evening prayers. I extinguish my lamp. I lay down in darkness that feels profound and final and entirely ordinary. Tomorrow I will wake and perform my dawn prayers and consume my rations and perhaps remember my own name, or perhaps not. It does not matter. The system functions correctly regardless of what any individual remembers or understands. The Necrons endure so that the galaxy may continue. They maintain what must be maintained. They harvest what must be harvested. This is their function. This is their eternal duty. This is correct. And I endure because I have been permitted to endure, shaped into a form that can serve without comprehending the full implications of that service, damaged precisely enough to remove dangerous knowledge while preserving useful functionality. This is also correct. In the time frame that matters to beings who measure existence in decades rather than geological epochs, this is the only form that correctness can take. I close my eyes. The pale light fades. The geometric patterns dissolve into comfortable darkness. I serve. I endure. I forget. This is my function. This is my mercy. This is all I have left.